U.S. History, an OpenStax textbook. Read along with the full text at www.openstax.org. You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more. Chapter 10, Jacksonian Democracy, 1820 to 1840.
Introduction.
The most extraordinary political development in the years before the Civil War was the rise of American democracy. Whereas the founders envisioned the United States as a republic, not a democracy, and had placed safeguards such as the Electoral College in the 1787 Constitution to prevent simple majority rule, the early 1820s saw many Americans embracing majority rule and rejecting old forms of deference that were based on elite ideas of virtue, learning, and family lineage. A new breed of politicians learned to harness the magic of the many by appealing to the resentments, fears, and passions of ordinary citizens to win elections. The charismatic Andrew Jackson gained a reputation as a fighter and defender of American expansion, emerging as the quintessential figure leading the rise of American democracy. In the image above, crowds flocked to the White House to celebrate his inauguration as president. While earlier inaugurations had been reserved for Washington's political elite, Jackson's was an event for the people, so much so that the pushing throngs caused thousands of dollars of damage to White House property. Characteristics of modern American democracy, including the turbulent nature of majority rule, first appeared during the age of Jackson.
(10.1) A New Political Style. From John Quincy Adams to Andrew Jackson. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain and illustrate the new style of American politics in the 1820s. Describe the policies of John Quincy Adams's presidency and explain the political divisions that resulted.
In the 1820s, American political culture gave way to the democratic urges of the citizenry. Political leaders and parties rose to popularity by championing the will of the people, pushing the country toward a future in which a wider swath of citizens gained a political voice. However, this expansion of political power was limited to white men. Women, free black people, and Native Americans remained, or grew increasingly, disenfranchised by the American political system. The decline of federalism. The first-party system in the United States shaped the political contest between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists, led by Washington, Hamilton, and Adams, dominated American politics in the 1790s. After the election of Thomas Jefferson, the Revolution of 1800, the Democratic Republicans gained ascendance. The gradual decline of the Federalist Party is evident in its losses in the presidential contests that occurred between 1800 and 1820. After 1816, in which Democratic Republican James Monroe defeated his Federalist rival, Rufus King, the Federalists never ran another presidential candidate. Before the 1820s, a code of deference had underwritten the Republic's political order. Deference was the practice of showing respect for individuals who had distinguished themselves through military accomplishments, educational attainment, business success, or family pedigree. Such individuals were members of what many Americans in the early republic agreed was a natural aristocracy. Deference shown to them dovetailed with republicanism and its emphasis on virtue, the ideal of placing the common good above narrow self-interest. Republican statesmen in the 1780s and 1790s expected and routinely received deferential treatment from others, and ordinary Americans deferred to their social betters as a matter of course. For the generation who lived through the American Revolution, for instance, George Washington epitomized Republican virtue, entitling him to great deference from his countrymen. His judgment and decisions were considered beyond reproach. An Anglican minister named Mason Locke Weems wrote the classic tale of Washington's unimpeachable virtue in his 1800 book, The Life of Washington. Generations of 19th century American children read its fictional story of a youthful Washington chopping down one of his father's cherry trees, and when confronted by his father, confessing, "I cannot tell a lie." The story spoke to Washington's unflinching honesty and integrity, encouraging readers to remember the deference owed to such towering national figures. Washington, and those who celebrated his role as president, established a standard for elite, virtuous leadership that cast a long shadow over subsequent presidential administrations. The presidents who followed Washington shared the first president's pedigree. With the exception of John Adams, who was from Massachusetts, all the early presidents, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, were members of Virginia's elite slaveholder aristocracy. Democratic reforms. In the early 1820s, deference to pedigree began to wane in American society. A new type of deference, to the will of the majority, and not to a ruling class, took hold. The spirit of democratic reform became most evident in the widespread belief that all white men, regardless of whether they owned property, had the right to participate in elections. Before the 1820s, many state constitutions had imposed property qualifications for voting as a means to keep democratic tendencies in check. However, as Federalist ideals fell out of favor, ordinary men from the middle and lower classes increasingly questioned the idea that property ownership was an indication of virtue. They argued for universal manhood suffrage, or voting rights for all white male adults. New states adopted constitutions that did not contain property qualifications for voting, a move designed to stimulate migration across their borders. Vermont and Kentucky admitted to the Union in 1791 and 1792, respectively, granted the right to vote to all white men, regardless of whether they owned property or paid taxes. Ohio's state constitution placed a minor tax-paying requirement on voters, but otherwise allowed for expansive white male suffrage. Alabama, admitted to the Union in 1819, eliminated property qualifications for voting in its state constitution. Two other new states, Indiana in 1816 and Illinois in 1818, also extended the right to vote to white men regardless of property. Initially, the new state of Mississippi in 1817 restricted voting to white male property holders, but in 1832 it eliminated this provision. In Connecticut, Federalist power largely collapsed in 1818 when the state held a constitutional convention. The new constitution granted the right to vote to all white men who paid taxes or served in the militia. Similarly, New York amended its state constitution in 1821 to 1822 and removed the property qualifications for voting. Expanded voting rights did not extend to women, Native, or free black people in the North. Indeed, race replaced property qualifications as the criterion for voting rights. American democracy had a decidedly racist orientation. A white majority limited the rights of black minorities. New Jersey explicitly restricted the right to vote to white men only. Connecticut passed a law in 1814 taking the right to vote away from free black men and restricting suffrage to white men only. By the 1820s, 80% of the white male population could vote in New York State elections. No other state had expanded suffrage so dramatically. At the same time, however, New York effectively disenfranchised free black men in 1822. Black men had had the right to vote under the 1777 Constitution by requiring that men of color must possess property over the value of $250. Party politics and the election of 1824. In addition to expanding white men's right to vote, democratic currents also led to a new style of political party organization, most evident in New York State in the years after the War of 1812. Under the leadership of Martin Van Buren, New York's Bucktail Republican faction, so named because members wore a deer's tail on their hats, a symbol of membership in the Tammany Society, gained political power by cultivating loyalty to the will of the majority, not to an elite family or renowned figure. The Bucktails emphasized a pragmatic approach. For example, at first, they opposed the Erie Canal project, but when the popularity of the massive transportation venture became clear, they supported it. One of the Bucktails' greatest achievements in New York came in the form of revisions to the state constitution in the 1820s. Under the original constitution, a council of appointments selected local officials such as sheriffs and county clerks. The Bucktails replaced this process with a system of direct elections, which meant thousands of jobs immediately became available to candidates who had the support of the majority. In practice, Van Buren's party could nominate and support their own candidates based on their loyalty to the party. In this way, Van Buren helped create a political machine of disciplined party members who prized loyalty above all else, a harbinger of future patronage politics in the United States. This system of rewarding party loyalists is known as the spoils system, from the expression, "To the victor belong the spoils." Van Buren's political machine helped radically transform New York politics. Party politics also transformed the national political landscape, and the election of 1824 proved a turning point in American politics. With tens of thousands of new voters, the older system of having members of Congress form congressional caucuses to determine who would run no longer worked. The new voters had regional interests and voted on them. For the first time, the popular vote mattered in a presidential election. Electors were chosen by popular vote in 18 states, while the 6 remaining states used the older system in which state legislatures chose electors. With the caucus system defunct, the presidential election of 1824 featured 5 candidates, all of whom ran as Democratic Republicans, the Federalists having ceased to be a national political force. The crowded field included John Quincy Adams, the son of the second president, John Adams. Candidate Adams had broken with the Federalists in the early 1800s and served on various diplomatic missions, including the mission to secure peace with Great Britain in 1814. He represented New England. A second candidate, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, had served as Secretary of War and represented the slaveholding South. He dropped out of the presidential race to run for vice president. A third candidate, Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, hailed from Kentucky and represented the western states. He favored an active federal government committed to internal improvements, such as roads and canals, to bolster national economic development and settlement of the West. William H. Crawford, a slaveholder from Georgia, suffered a stroke in 1823 that left him largely incapacitated, but he ran nonetheless, and had the backing of the New York machine headed by Van Buren. Andrew Jackson, the famed hero of New Orleans, rounded out the field. Jackson had very little formal education, but he was popular for his military victories in the War of 1812 and in wars against the Creek and the Seminole. He had been elected to the Senate in 1823, and his popularity soared as pro-Jackson newspapers sang the praises of the courage and daring of the Tennessee slaveholder. Results from the 18 states where the popular vote determined the electoral vote gave Jackson the election, with over 152,000 votes to Adams's 114,000, Clay's 47,000, and Crawford's just shy of 47,000. The Electoral College, however, was another matter. Of the 261 electoral votes, Jackson needed 131 or better to win, but secured only 99. Adams won 84, Crawford 41, and Clay 37. Because Jackson did not receive a majority vote from the Electoral College, the election was decided following the terms of the 12th Amendment, which stipulated that when a candidate did not receive a majority of electoral votes, the election went to the House of Representatives, where each state would provide one vote. House Speaker Clay did not want to see his rival Jackson become president, and therefore worked within the House to secure the presidency for Adams, convincing many to cast their vote for the New Englander. Clay's efforts paid off. Despite not having won the popular vote, John Quincy Adams was certified by the House as the next president. Once in office, he elevated Henry Clay to the post of Secretary of State. Jackson and his supporters cried foul. To them, the election of Adams reeked of anti-democratic corruption. So too did the appointment of Clay as Secretary of State. John C. Calhoun labeled the whole affair a corrupt bargain. Everywhere, Jackson supporters vowed revenge against the anti-majoritarian result of 1824. The presidency of John Quincy Adams. Secretary of State Clay championed what was known as the American System of High Tariffs, a national bank, and federally sponsored internal improvements of canals and roads. Once in office, President Adams embraced Clay's American system and proposed a national university and naval academy to train future leaders of the Republic. The president's opponents smelled elitism in these proposals and pounced on what they viewed as the administration's catering to a small, privileged class at the expense of ordinary citizens. Clay also envisioned a broad range of internal transportation improvements. Using the proceeds from land sales in the West, Adams endorsed the creation of roads and canals to facilitate commerce and the advance of settlement in the West. Many in Congress vigorously opposed federal funding of internal improvements, citing among other reasons that the Constitution did not give the federal government the power to fund these projects. However, in the end, Adams succeeded in extending the Cumberland Road into Ohio, a federal highway project. He also broke ground for the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal on July 4, 1828. Tariffs, which both Clay and Adams promoted, were not a novel idea. Since the birth of the Republic, they had been seen as a way to advance domestic manufacturing by making imports more expensive. Congress had approved a tariff in 1789, for instance, and Alexander Hamilton had proposed a protective tariff in 1790. Congress also passed tariffs in 1816 and 1824. Clay spearheaded the drive for the federal government to impose high tariffs to help bolster domestic manufacturing. If imported goods were more expensive than domestic goods, then people would buy American-made goods. President Adams wished to promote manufacturing, especially in his home region of New England. To that end, in 1828, he proposed a high tariff on imported goods, amounting to 50% of their value. The tariff raised questions about how power should be distributed, causing a fiery debate between those who supported states' rights and those who supported the expanded power of the federal government. Those who championed states' rights denounced the 1828 measure as the Tariff of Abominations, clear evidence that the federal government favored one region, in this case the North, over another, the South. They made their case by pointing out that the North had an expanding manufacturing base while the South did not. Therefore, the South imported far more manufactured goods than the North, causing the tariff to fall most heavily on the southern states. The 1828 tariff generated additional fears among Southerners. In particular, it suggested to them that the federal government would unilaterally take steps that hurt the South. This line of reasoning led some Southerners to fear that the very foundation of the South, slavery, could come under attack from a hostile Northern majority in Congress. The spokesman for this Southern view was President Adams's vice president, John C. Calhoun.
Defining American, John C. Calhoun on the Tariff of 1828. Vice President John C. Calhoun, angry about the passage of the Tariff of 1828, anonymously wrote a report titled South Carolina Exposition and Protest, later known as Calhoun's Exposition, for the South Carolina legislature. As a native of South Carolina, Calhoun articulated the fear among many Southerners that the federal government could exercise undue power over the states.
If it be conceded, as it must be by everyone who is the least conversant with our institutions, that the sovereign powers delegated are divided between the general and state governments, and that the latter hold their portion by the same tenure as the former, it would seem impossible to deny to the states the right of deciding on the infractions of their powers, and the proper remedy to be applied for their correction. The right of judging in such cases is an essential attribute of sovereignty, of which the states cannot be divested without losing their sovereignty itself and being reduced to a subordinate corporate condition. In fact, to divide power, and to give to one of the parties the exclusive right of judging of the portion allotted to each, is in reality not to divide it at all. And to reserve such exclusive right to the general government, it matters not by what department to be exercised, is to convert it in fact into a great consolidated government with unlimited powers, and to divest the states in reality of all their rights. It is impossible to understand the force of terms and to deny so plain a conclusion. John C. Calhoun, South Carolina Exposition and Protest, 1828.
What is Calhoun's main point of protest? What does he say about the sovereignty of the states? (10.2) The Rise of American Democracy. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the key points of the election of 1828. Explain the scandals of Andrew Jackson's first term in office.
A turning point in American political history occurred in 1828, which witnessed the election of Andrew Jackson over the incumbent John Quincy Adams. While Democratic practices had been in ascendance since 1800, the year also saw the further unfolding of a democratic spirit in the United States. Supporters of Jackson called themselves Democrats or the Democracy, giving birth to the Democratic Party. Political authority appeared to rest with the majority as never before. The campaign and election of 1828. During the 1800s, Democratic reforms made steady progress with the abolition of property qualifications for voting and the birth of new forms of political party organization. The 1828 campaign pushed new democratic practices even further and highlighted the difference between the Jacksonian expanded electorate and the older, exclusive Adams style. A slogan of the day, "Adams who can write, Jackson who can fight," captured the contrast between Adams the aristocrat and Jackson the frontiersman. The 1828 campaign differed significantly from earlier presidential contests because of the party organization that promoted Andrew Jackson. Jackson and his supporters reminded voters of the corrupt bargain of 1824. They framed it as the work of a small group of political elites, deciding who would lead the nation, acting in a self-serving manner, and ignoring the will of the majority. From Nashville, Tennessee, the Jackson campaign organized supporters around the nation through editorials in partisan newspapers and other publications. Pro-Jackson newspapers heralded the hero of New Orleans while denouncing Adams. Though he did not wage an election campaign filled with public appearances, Jackson did give one major campaign speech in New Orleans on January 8th, the anniversary of the defeat of the British in 1815. He also engaged in rounds of discussion with politicians who came to his home, the Hermitage, in Nashville. At the local level, Jackson's supporters worked to bring in as many new voters as possible. Rallies, parades, and other rituals further broadcast the message that Jackson stood for the common man against the corrupt elite backing Adams and Clay. Democratic organizations called Hickory Clubs, a tribute to Jackson's nickname, Old Hickory, also worked tirelessly to ensure his election. In November 1828, Jackson won an overwhelming victory over Adams, capturing 56% of the popular vote and 68% of the electoral vote. As in 1800, when Jefferson had won over the Federalist incumbent John Adams, the presidency passed to a new political party, the Democrats. The election was the climax of several decades of expanding democracy in the United States and the end of the older politics of deference. Scandal in the presidency. Amid revelations of widespread fraud, including the disclosure that some $300,000 was missing from the Treasury Department, Jackson removed almost 50% of appointed civil officers, which allowed him to handpick their replacements. This replacement of appointed federal officials is called rotation in office. Lucrative posts, such as postmaster and deputy postmaster, went to party loyalists, especially in places where Jackson's support had been weakest, such as New England. Some Democratic newspaper editors who had supported Jackson during the campaign also gained public jobs. Jackson's opponents were angered and took to calling the practice the spoils system, after the policies of Van Buren's Bucktail Republican Party. The rewarding of party loyalists with government jobs resulted in spectacular instances of corruption. Perhaps the most notorious occurred in New York City, where a Jackson appointee made off with over $1 million. Such examples seemed proof positive that the Democrats were disregarding merit, education, and respectability in decisions about the governing of the nation. In addition to dealing with rancor over rotation in office, the Jackson administration became embroiled in a personal scandal known as the Petticoat Affair. This incident exacerbated the division between the president's team and the insider class in the nation's capital, who found the new arrivals from Tennessee lacking in decorum and propriety. At the center of the storm was Margaret Peggy O'Neill, a well-known socialite in Washington, D.C. O'Neill had connections to the Republic's most powerful men. She married John Timberlake, a naval officer, and they had 3 children. Rumors abounded, however, about her involvement with John Eaton, a U.S. Senator from Tennessee who had come to Washington in 1818. Timberlake committed suicide in 1828, setting off a flurry of rumors that he had been distraught over his wife's reputed infidelities. Eaton and Mrs. Timberlake married soon after, with the full approval of President Jackson. The so-called Petticoat Affair divided Washington society. Many Washington socialites snubbed the new Mrs. Eaton as a woman of low moral character. Among those who would have nothing to do with her was Vice President John C. Calhoun's wife, Florid. Calhoun fell out of favor with President Jackson, who defended Peggy Eaton and derided those who would not socialize with her, declaring she was as chaste as a virgin. Jackson had personal reasons for defending Eaton. He drew a parallel between Eaton's treatment and that of his late wife Rachel, who had been subjected to attacks on her reputation related to her first marriage, which had ended in divorce. Martin Van Buren, who defended the Eatons and organized social gatherings with them, became close to Jackson, who came to rely on a group of informal advisors that included Van Buren and was dubbed the Kitchen Cabinet. This select group of presidential supporters highlights the importance of party loyalty to Jackson and the Democratic Party.
.3 The Nullification Crisis and the Bank War. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the factors that contributed to the nullification crisis. Discuss the origins and creation of the Whig Party.
The crisis over the tariff of 1828 continued into the 1830s and highlighted one of the currents of democracy in the age of Jackson, namely that many Southerners believed a Democratic majority could be harmful to their interests. These Southerners saw themselves as an embattled minority and claimed the right of states to nullify federal laws that appeared to threaten state sovereignty. Another undercurrent was the resentment and anger of the majority against symbols of elite privilege, especially powerful financial institutions like the Second Bank of the United States. The Nullification Crisis. The tariff of 1828 had driven Vice President Calhoun to pen his South Carolina Exposition and Protest, in which he argued that if a national majority acted against the interest of a regional minority, then individual states could void or nullify federal law. By the early 1830s, the battle over the tariff took on new urgency as the price of cotton continued to fall. In 1818, cotton had been 31 cents per pound. By 1831, it had sunk to 8 cents per pound. While production of cotton had soared during this time, and this increase contributed to the decline in prices, many Southerners blamed their economic problems squarely on the tariff for raising the prices they had to pay for imported goods while their own income shrank. Resentment of the tariff was linked directly to the issue of slavery because the tariff demonstrated the use of federal power. Some Southerners feared the federal government would next take additional action against the South, including the abolition of slavery. The theory of nullification, or the voiding of unwelcome federal laws, provided wealthy slaveholders, who were a minority in the United States, with an argument for resisting the national government if it acted contrary to their interests. James Hamilton, who served as governor of South Carolina in the early 1830s, denounced the despotic majority that oppresses us. Nullification also raised the specter of secession. Aggrieved states at the mercy of an aggressive majority would be forced to leave the Union. On the issue of nullification, South Carolina stood alone. Other Southern states backed away from what they saw as the extremism behind the idea. President Jackson did not make the repeal of the 1828 tariff a priority and denied the nullifier's arguments. He and others, including former President Madison, argued that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gave Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Jackson pledged to protect the Union against those who would try to tear it apart over the tariff issue. "The Union shall be preserved," he declared in 1830. To deal with the crisis, Jackson advocated a reduction in tariff rates. The tariff of 1832, passed in the summer, lowered the rates on some products like imported goods, a move designed to calm Southerners. It did not have the desired effect, however, and Calhoun's nullifiers still claimed their right to override federal law. In November, South Carolina passed the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring the 1828 and 1832 tariffs null and void in the Palmetto State. Jackson responded, however, by declaring in the December 1832 Nullification Proclamation that a state did not have the power to void a federal law. With the states and the federal government at an impasse, civil war seemed a real possibility. The next governor of South Carolina, Robert Hayne, called for a force of 10,000 volunteers to defend the state against any federal action. At the same time, South Carolinians who opposed the nullifiers told Jackson that 8,000 men stood ready to defend the Union. Congress passed the Force Bill of 1833, which gave the federal government the right to use federal troops to ensure compliance with federal law. The crisis, or at least the prospect of armed conflict in South Carolina, was diffused by the compromise tariff of 1833, which reduced tariff rates considerably. Nullifiers in South Carolina accepted it, but in a move that demonstrated their inflexibility, they nullified the Force Bill. The nullification crisis illustrated the growing tensions in American democracy, an aggrieved minority of elite, wealthy slaveholders taking a stand against the will of a Democratic majority, an emerging sectional divide between South and North over slavery, and a clash between those who believed in free trade and those who believed in protective tariffs to encourage the nation's economic growth. These tensions would color the next 3 decades of politics in the United States. The Bank War. Congress established the Bank of the United States in 1791 as a key pillar of Alexander Hamilton's financial program, but its 20-year charter expired in 1811. Congress, swayed by the majority's hostility to the bank as an institution catering to the wealthy elite, did not renew the charter at that time. In its place, Congress approved a new national bank, the Second Bank of the United States, in 1816. It too had a 20-year charter, set to expire in 1836. The Second Bank of the United States was created to stabilize the banking system. More than 200 banks existed in the United States in 1816, and almost all of them issued paper money. In other words, citizens faced a bewildering welter of paper money with no standard value. In fact, the problem of paper money had contributed significantly to the Panic of 1819. In the 1820s, the National Bank moved into a magnificent new building in Philadelphia. However, despite Congress's approval of the Second Bank of the United States, a great many people continued to view it as a tool of the wealthy, an anti-democratic force. President Jackson was among them. He had faced economic crises of his own during his days speculating in land, an experience that had made him uneasy about paper money. To Jackson, hard currency, that is, gold or silver, was the far better alternative. The president also personally disliked the bank's director, Nicholas Biddle. A large part of the allure of mass democracy for politicians was the opportunity to capture the anger and resentment of ordinary Americans against what they saw as the privileges of a few. One of the leading opponents of the bank was Thomas Hart Benton, a senator from Missouri, who declared that the bank served to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. The self-important statements of Biddle, who claimed to have more power than President Jackson, helped fuel sentiments like Benton's. In the re-election campaign of 1832, Jackson's opponents in Congress, including Henry Clay, hoped to use their support of the bank to their advantage. In January 1832, they pushed for legislation that would recharter it, even though its charter was not scheduled to expire until 1836. When the bill for rechartering passed and came to President Jackson, he used his executive authority to veto the measure. The defeat of the Second Bank of the United States demonstrates Jackson's ability to focus on the specific issues that aroused the Democratic majority. Jackson understood people's anger and distrust toward the bank, which stood as an emblem of special privilege and big government. He skillfully used that perception to his advantage, presenting the bank issue as a struggle of ordinary people against a rapacious elite class who cared nothing for the public and pursued only their own selfish ends. As Jackson portrayed it, his was a battle for small government and ordinary Americans. His stand against what bank opponents called the monster bank proved very popular, and the Democratic press lionized him for it. In the election of 1832, Jackson received nearly 53% of the popular vote against his opponent Henry Clay. Jackson's veto was only one part of the war on the monster bank. In 1833, the president removed the deposits from the National Bank and placed them in state banks. Biddle, the bank's director, retaliated by restricting loans to the state banks, resulting in a reduction of the money supply. The financial turmoil only increased when Jackson issued an executive order known as the Specie Circular, which required that Western land sales be conducted using gold or silver only. Unfortunately, this policy proved a disaster when the Bank of England, the source of much of the hard currency borrowed by American businesses, dramatically cut back on loans to the United States. Without the flow of hard currency from England, American depositors drained the gold and silver from their own domestic banks, making hard currency scarce. Adding to the economic distress of the late 1830s, cotton prices plummeted, contributing to a financial crisis called the Panic of 1837. This economic panic would prove politically useful for Jackson's opponents in the coming years, and Van Buren, elected president in 1836, would pay the price for Jackson's hard currency preferences. Whigs. Jackson's veto of the bank and his specie circular helped galvanize opposition forces into a new political party, the Whigs, a faction that began to form in 1834. The name was significant. Opponents of Jackson saw him as exercising tyrannical power, so they chose the name Whig after the 18th century political party that resisted the monarchical power of King George III. One political cartoon dubbed the president King Andrew I and displayed Jackson standing on the Constitution, which has been ripped to shreds. Whigs championed an active federal government committed to internal improvements, including a national bank. They made their first national appearance in the presidential election of 1836, a contest that pitted Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, against a field of several Whig candidates. Indeed, the large field of Whig candidates indicated the new party's lack of organization compared to the Democrats. This helped Van Buren, who carried the day in the Electoral College. As the effects of the Panic of 1837 continued to be felt for years afterward, the Whig press pinned the blame for the economic crisis on Van Buren and the Democrats.
(10.4) Indian Removal. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the legal wrangling that surrounded the Indian Removal Act. Describe how depictions of Native peoples in popular culture helped lead to Native removal. Describe the Indian Removal Act's effect on Native American people and their responses to it.
Pro-Jackson newspapers touted the president as a champion of opening land for white settlement and moving Native inhabitants beyond the boundaries of American civilization. In this effort, Jackson reflected majority opinion. Most Americans believed Native peoples had no place in the white republic. Jackson's animosity toward Native Americans ran deep. He had fought against the Creek in 1813 and against the Seminole in 1817, and his reputation and popularity rested in large measure on his firm commitment to remove Native residents from states in the South. The 1830 Indian Removal Act and subsequent displacement of the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee tribes of the Southeast fulfilled the vision of a white nation and became one of the identifying characteristics of the age of Jackson. Native Americans in popular culture. Popular culture in the first half of the 19th century reflected the aversion to Native Americans that was pervasive during the age of Jackson. Jackson skillfully played upon this racial hatred to engage the United States in a policy of ethnic cleansing, eradicating the Native presence from the land to make way for white civilization. In an age of mass democracy, powerful anti-Native sentiments found expression in mass culture, shaping popular perceptions. James Fenimore Cooper's very popular historical novel, The Last of the Mohicans, published in 1826 as part of his Leatherstocking series, told the tale of Nathaniel Natty Bumppo, also known as Hawkeye, who lived among Native Americans but had been born to white parents. Cooper provides a romantic version of the French and Indian War in which Natty helps the British against the French and the feral, bloodthirsty Huron. Natty endures even as his Native American friends die, including the noble Uncas, the last Mohican, in a narrative that dovetailed with most people's approval of Native removal. Native Americans also made frequent appearances in art. George Catlin produced many paintings of Native peoples, which he offered as true representations despite routinely emphasizing their supposed savage nature. The cutting scene, Mandan Oki Pa ceremony, is one example. Scholars have long questioned the accuracy of this portrayal of a rite of passage among the Mandan people. Accuracy aside, the painting captured the imaginations of white viewers, reinforcing their disgust at the savagery of Native Americans.
Americana, the paintings of George Catlin. George Catlin seized upon the public fascination with the supposedly exotic and savage Native American, seeing an opportunity to make money by painting them in a way that conformed to popular white stereotypes. In the late 1830s, he toured major cities with his Indian Gallery, a collection of paintings of Native peoples. Though he hoped his exhibition would be profitable, it did not bring him financial security. Catlin routinely painted Native Americans in a supposedly aboriginal state. In attacking the grizzly bear, the hunters do not have rifles and instead rely on spears. Such a portrayal stretches credibility, as Native peoples had long been exposed to and adopted European weapons. Indeed, the painting's depiction of Native people riding horses, which were introduced by the Spanish, makes clear that, as much as Catlin and white viewers wanted to believe in the primitive and savage native, the reality was otherwise. In Wijunjan, Pigeon's Egghead, The Light. Going to and returning from Washington, the viewer is shown a before and after portrait of Wijunjan, who tried to emulate white dress and manners after going to Washington, D.C. What differences do you see between these two representations of Wijunjan? Do you think his attempt to imitate white people was successful? Why or why not? What do you think Catlin was trying to convey with this depiction of Wijunjan's assimilation?
The Indian Removal Act. In his first message to Congress, Jackson had proclaimed that Native American groups living independently within states, as sovereign entities, presented a major problem for state sovereignty. This message referred directly to the situation in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama, where the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee peoples stood as obstacles to white settlement. These groups were known as the Five Civilized Tribes because they had largely adopted Anglo-American culture, speaking English and practicing Christianity. Some held enslaved people like their white counterparts. White people especially resented the Cherokee in Georgia, coveting the tribe's rich agricultural lands in the northern part of the state. The impulse to remove the Cherokee only increased when gold was discovered on their lands. Ironically, while white people insisted the Cherokee and other native peoples could never be good citizens because of their savage ways, the Cherokee had arguably gone farther than any other indigenous group in adopting white culture. The Cherokee Phoenix, the newspaper of the Cherokee, began publication in 1828 in English and the Cherokee language. Although the Cherokee followed the lead of their white neighbors by farming and owning property, as well as embracing Christianity and enslaving people, this proved of little consequence in an era when white people perceived all Native Americans as incapable of becoming full citizens of the Republic. Jackson's anti-Native stance struck a chord with a majority of white citizens, many of whom shared a hatred of non-white people that spurred Congress to pass the 1830 Indian Removal Act. The act called for the removal of the Five Civilized Tribes from their home in the southeastern United States to land in the West, in present-day Oklahoma. Jackson declared in December 1830, "It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years, in relation to the removal of the Native Americans beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. 2 important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes also to seek the same obvious advantages." The Cherokee decided to fight the federal law, however, and took their case to the Supreme Court. Their legal fight had the support of anti-Jackson members of Congress, including Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and they retained the legal services of former Attorney General William Wirt. In Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, Wirt argued that the Cherokee constituted an independent foreign nation, and that an injunction, a stop, should be placed on Georgia laws aimed at eradicating them. In 1831, the Supreme Court found the Cherokee did not meet the criteria for being a foreign nation. Another case involving the Cherokee also found its way to the highest court in the land. This legal struggle, Worcester v. Georgia, asserted the rights of non-natives to live on Native American lands. Samuel Worcester was a Christian missionary and federal postmaster of Nuakota, the capital of the Cherokee Nation. A Congregationalist, he had gone to live among the Cherokee in Georgia to further the spread of Christianity, and he strongly opposed Native American removal. By living among the Cherokee, Worcester had violated a Georgia law forbidding white people, unless they were agents of the federal government, to live in Native American territory. Worcester was arrested, but because his federal job as postmaster gave him the right to live there, he was released. Jackson supporters then succeeded in taking away Worcester's job, and he was rearrested. This time, a court sentenced him and 9 others for violating the Georgia state law banning white people from living on native land. Worcester was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor. When the case of Worcester v. Georgia came before the Supreme Court in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of Worcester, finding that the Cherokee constituted distinct political communities with sovereign rights to their own territory. The Supreme Court did not have the power to enforce its ruling in Worcester v. Georgia, however, and it became clear that the Cherokee would be compelled to move. Those who understood that the only option was removal traveled west, but the majority stayed on their land. In order to remove them, the president relied on the U.S. military. In a series of forced marches, some 15,000 Cherokee were finally relocated to Oklahoma. This forced migration, known as the Trail of Tears, caused the deaths of as many as 4,000 Cherokee. The Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples were also compelled to go. The removal of the 5 civilized tribes provides an example of the power of majority opinion in a democracy.
Defining American. Chief Justice John Marshall's ruling in Worcester v. Georgia. In 1832, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall ruled in favor of Samuel Worcester in Worcester v. Georgia. In doing so, he established the principle of tribal sovereignty. Although this judgment contradicted Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, it failed to halt the Indian Removal Act. In his opinion, Marshall wrote the following:
From the commencement of our government, Congress has passed acts to regulate trade and intercourse with the Indians, which treat them as nations, respect their rights, and manifest a firm purpose to afford that protection which treaties stipulate. All these acts, and especially that of 1802, which is still in force, manifestly consider the several Indian nations as distinct political communities, having territorial boundaries within which their authority is exclusive, and having a right to all the lands within those boundaries, which is not only acknowledged, but guaranteed by the United States. The Cherokee Nation, then, is a distinct community, occupying its own territory, with boundaries accurately described, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force, and which the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter, but with the assent of the Cherokees themselves, or in conformity with treaties and with the acts of Congress. The whole intercourse between the United States and this nation is, by our Constitution and laws, vested in the government of the United States. The act of the state of Georgia under which the plaintiff in error was prosecuted is consequently void, and the judgment a nullity. The acts of Georgia are repugnant to the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States.
How does this opinion differ from the outcome of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia just 1 year earlier? Why do you think the two outcomes were different?
Black Hawk's War. The policy of removal led some Native Americans to actively resist. In 1832, the Fox and the Sauk, led by Sauk Chief Black Hawk Makataimashekiakia, moved back across the Mississippi River to reclaim their ancestral home in northern Illinois. A brief war in 1832, Black Hawk's War, ensued. White settlers panicked at the return of the Sauk, and militias and federal troops quickly mobilized. At the Bad Axe Massacre, they killed over 200 men, women, and children. Some 70 white settlers and soldiers, also lost their lives in the conflict. The war, which lasted only a matter of weeks, illustrates how much white people on the frontier hated and feared Native Americans during the Age of Jackson.
(10.5) The Tyranny and Triumph of the Majority. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain Alexis de Tocqueville's analysis of American democracy. Describe the election of 1840 and its outcome.
To some observers, the rise of democracy in the United States raised troubling questions about the new power of the majority to silence minority opinion. As the will of the majority became the rule of the day, everyone outside of mainstream white American opinion, especially Native American and Black people, were vulnerable to the wrath of the majority. Some worried that the rights of those who opposed the will of the majority would never be safe. Mass democracy also shaped political campaigns as never before. The 1840 presidential election marked a significant turning point in the evolving style of American democratic politics. Alexis de Tocqueville. Perhaps the most insightful commentator on American democracy was the young French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville, whom the French government sent to the United States to report on American prison reforms. Tocqueville marveled at the spirit of democracy that pervaded American life. Given his place in French society, however, much of what he saw of American democracy caused him concern. Tocqueville's experience led him to believe that democracy was an unstoppable force that would one day overthrow monarchy around the world. He wrote and published his findings in 1835 and 1840 in a two-part work entitled Democracy in America. In analyzing the democratic revolution in the United States, he wrote that the major benefit of democracy came in the form of equality before the law. A great deal of the social revolution of democracy, however, carried negative consequences. Indeed, Tocqueville described a new type of tyranny, the tyranny of the majority, which overpowers the will of minorities and individuals, and was, in his view, unleashed by democracy in the United States. In this excerpt from Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville warns of the dangers of democracy when the majority will can turn to tyranny.
When an individual or a party is wronged in the United States, to whom can he apply for redress? If to public opinion constitutes the majority. If to the legislature, it represents the majority, and implicitly obeys its injunctions. If to the executive power, it is appointed by the majority and remains a passive tool in its hands. The public troops consist of the majority under arms. The jury is the majority invested with the right of hearing judicial cases, and in certain states, even the judges are elected by the majority. However iniquitous or absurd the evil of which you complain may be, you must submit to it as well as you can. The authority of a king is purely physical, and it controls the actions of the subject without subduing his private will. But the majority possesses a power which is physical and moral at the same time. It acts upon the will as well as upon the actions of men, and it represses not only all contest but all controversy. I know no country in which there is so little true independence of mind and freedom of discussion as in America.
The 1840 election. The presidential election contest of 1840 marked the culmination of the democratic revolution that swept the United States. By this time, the second-party system had taken hold, a system whereby the older Federalist and Democratic-Republican parties had been replaced by the new Democratic and Whig parties. Both Whigs and Democrats jockeyed for election victories and commanded the steady loyalty of political partisans. Large-scale presidential campaign rallies and emotional propaganda became the order of the day. Voter turnout increased dramatically under the second-party system. Roughly 25% of eligible voters had cast ballots in 1828. In 1840, voter participation surged to nearly 80%. The differences between the parties were largely about economic policies. Whigs advocated accelerated economic growth, often endorsing federal government projects to achieve that goal. Democrats did not view the federal government as an engine promoting economic growth and advocated a smaller role for the national government. The membership of the parties also differed. Whigs tended to be wealthier. They were prominent planters in the South and wealthy urban Northerners. In other words, the beneficiaries of the market revolution. Democrats presented themselves as defenders of the common people against the elite. In the 1840 presidential campaign, taking their cue from the Democrats, who had lionized Jackson's military accomplishments, the Whigs promoted William Henry Harrison as a war hero based on his 1811 military service against the Shawnee chief Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe. John Tyler of Virginia ran as the vice presidential candidate, leading the Whigs to trumpet "Tippecanoe and Tyler too" as a campaign slogan. The campaign thrust Harrison into the national spotlight. Democrats tried to discredit him by declaring, "Give him a barrel of hard alcoholic cider and settle a pension of $2,000 a year on him, and take my word for it, he will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin." The Whigs turned the slur to their advantage by presenting Harrison as a man of the people who had been born in a log cabin. In fact, he came from a privileged background in Virginia, and the contest became known as the Log Cabin Campaign. At Whig political rallies, the faithful were treated to whiskey made by the E.C. Booze Company, leading to the introduction of the word booze into the American lexicon. Tippecanoe clubs, where booze flowed freely, helped in the marketing of the Whig candidate. The Whigs' efforts, combined with their strategy of blaming Democrats for the lingering economic collapse that began with the hard currency panic of 1837, succeeded in carrying the day. A mass campaign with political rallies and party mobilization had molded a candidate to fit an ideal palatable to a majority of American voters. And in 1840, Harrison won what many consider the first modern election. This has been U.S. History from OpenStax. OpenStax textbooks and this free audiobook are covered under a Creative Commons license. The full text is available at www.openstax.org. This project was made possible by CC ECHO, the California Consortium for Equitable Change in Hispanic-Serving Institutions, Open Education Resources. You can learn more about CC ECHO by visiting the link in this episode's show notes. You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more. Instructors can even download a course shell to embed these recordings in Canvas courses. Learn more by visiting www.openaudio.us. Did you find this audiobook helpful? If so, let us know by leaving a comment and sharing this recording with a colleague or a friend.